Thanks very much, Des. We're here in Cape Town, outside of City Hall, where we're eagerly anticipating that budget speech from Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana. And like you say, there's so many issues that he has to deal with and address in terms of where he's going to be putting public funds to. And of course, one of the biggest issues is the energy crisis and finding ways to alleviate that crisis. To discuss this further and other issues, I'm joined by Mr. Tertius Troost. He's a tax expert at Mazars. Thank you so much for joining us, Tertius. So, of course, the energy crisis is the biggest issue. What is it that you expect the Finance Minister to speak to that is of particular interest to you as a tax expert?
Yes, specifically to me is how he's going to just alleviate the crisis and how he's going to try to put money into the pockets of consumers who are trying to find different ways of making their own energy. For example, the solar question is how are we going to get money to these people to put in solars on their roofs and therefore help Eskom in that way?
So when it comes to giving households and business relief, which is something that President Ramaphosa has hinted to at the SONA, how do you think that will be best? What's the best method to do? Because one of the things that I came across is that perhaps we should look at lower tariffs, as a lot of this stuff is imported, solar panels, etc. Look at cutting tariffs so that the price is cheaper rather than trying to subsidize, because we know that the fiscus is under pressure. What are your thoughts?
There are quite a few options. I must say purely speculative at the moment, but one of the options could be the zero rating of these items for VAT, therefore making it cheaper for people to purchase it. The issue with that is you could have the risk of it the price reduction not filtering through to the consumer, but the producers or the installers maybe taking a higher margin. Another option is tax allowances or capital allowances. It should be noted that we already have one in place in terms of Section 12 Capital B, which allows for certain reductions for your costs. But that's only applicable if you use it in your trade. So now you want something that you can maybe use to the consumer, saying you can get a deduction against your salary and your normal taxable income. So that's maybe another option they could look at. From a tariff point of view, some of the items are already at a reduced tariff, so maybe that's not the way to go. But you want money in the pocket. Another option was we've recently seen the closing down of the venture capital company regime, but maybe that could be just revitalized and more focused towards the renewable energy sector, because it's an industry that's already thriving. You can use the people that have set up businesses and get those deductions, get money into the pockets of the consumers. Thereby they'll be making use much more solar, less stress on Eskom.
I think the critical thing here, as much as obviously National Treasury will want to have as much money coming in from a tax revenue perspective, ultimately if they don't give the South African public those breaks, we're not going to be in a position to begin to spur economic growth, which in turn means that the revenues for the fiscus will always be diminished because the economy won't grow.
It's a very fine balance. You saw previously in the prior year the super cycle in the commodities. We saw a big uptick of funds flowing in. That's not going to be sustainable. The target of nearly 7 trillion rand is a big amount to receive. So as you've rightly pointed out, anything you give in the form of incentives, you need to get somewhere else. We saw when they reduced the corporate tax rate from 28 to 27%, they made certain other amendments so that it remains a tax neutral basis, so we don't lose too much money. So that's the important thing, that there needs to be money in order to provide the incentives.
So what's your view around the basic income grant? We know that's something that government is still looking at. They call that a permanent solution to dealing with the issue of unemployed people who don't have access to cash. We have the social relief of distress grant that was introduced as a result of COVID. We know that's coming to an end at the end of 2024, March 2024, and we have to wait and see whether there's going to be pronouncements about assistance going beyond that. One of the things that Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana has said is that in order for there to be a permanent solution, there'll be a need to an increase in permanent or higher permanent revenues. And we know that the Finance Minister is not in a position to really raise taxes in a fundamental way. So what are your expectations around this in the short to medium term?
Yeah, so could there be a shock? Could there be a shock increase we don't know about? I don't expect it. I mean, we've had the pushback when we saw the increase in the VAT rate. I can't imagine that we'll see something like that again, but it's not off the table. The other option, obviously, if you can't raise tax revenue, where else do you get it? Bond market, you need to lend more money. We're already sitting at a debt to GDP ratio of just above 70%. Could they push that slightly higher to fund this? Not the best mechanism, because you're loaning money in order to give it to the poor, but it's needed. We do see that we've got high unemployment rate. There is money needed. At the same time, if you put money into people's pockets, they spend it, and it stimulates, and you get that revenue back in the form of VAT and so on. So it's not bad, but yes, it's a very fine balance of where do you find that money, and is it going to be in the bond market.
You talk about the debt to GDP ratio being just above 70%. And of course, the big question is that if government does take on some of the Eskom debt, up to 2/3 of it, and that stands at around 422 billion rand, that is the Eskom debt. What does that then do to the debt to GDP ratio? And we already know that government is spending a whopping load, about 340 billion rand a year, on just paying our debt service costs. What does that do to that profile and to our debt profile? Surely that's a mess.
Very true, and you need to understand that interest rates are also rising. So the 300 billion figure you're speaking about, that could increase just with the current interest rates. We back it above 10% in our bond market. So yes, it is a scary figure, and we have seen in the past that they're willing to push this number even up to 80%. And the question is, you just need a plan of bringing that down again. You can't just keep lending and having that figure ever increasing. Internationally, it's still fine, but it all depends on the growth that's coupled with it. South Africa, having that type of figure, you expect a growth figure of actually above 2%. We're sitting with estimations of 1.4, certain people saying, hey, it's actually below 1%. So very important that the more you lend, you need to have proper growth prospects in place so that you can service that debt.
Tertius, thank you very much for your time there. That was Tertius Troost. He's the tax expert at Mazars. And of course, it's very important what happens with that growth number. The Reserve Bank is expecting the economy to grow by 0.3% this year. And that's on account of all the load shedding that we've been experiencing. We've been having that incessantly for a number of days since last year. They expect that we're going to experience load shedding for a minimum of 250 days. We haven't had any let up. We're now on stage 6. Unofficially, I reckon we're at stage 7, because we have 7,000 megawatts of megawatts that we're not able to tap onto right now. So that suggests a stage 7. So if the National Treasury now is estimating growth to be round about where the Reserve Bank is estimating it to be, that will be very detrimental, because it means that they're going to likely forecast a lesser growth in revenue intake for the next financial year. And of course, they have less money to be able to play with. And if our debt increases on the back of taking on debt from Eskom, that means that we're going to be paying more in the way of debt service costs. If we're paying something like 350 billion rand per day, which is nearly 1 billion rand per day for our debt payment costs, that means we're taking away from spending on our priorities that we need to so desperately service, like our socio-economic issues. And of course, the big elephant in the room right now is the public sector wage talks. Government said that they only had about 4.2% of an increase available to the public sector for the 2022-2023 year, but now the unions are now looking for a much higher figure related to inflation. In fact, above that, 10% for the 2022 year, and they're pushing for about 12% for the next fiscal year. So if government is not able to stand its ground, that's going to be a key threat as well. Of course, lots more to discuss, and we'll be having more conversations with the experts as the day progresses ahead of that 2 o'clock speech by Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana. It's back to you in studio, Desiree.